Evelyn Waugh warned that the ancestral seats of Britain were doomed to decay and spoliation like the monasteries in the 16th century. But when some aristocrats started demolishing their ancestral seats because they could no longer afford to keep them up, the National Trust became concerned and launched a scheme to help preserve them.
Unless something is done to preserve these beautiful old country houses and gardens, in a generation, half of them will be in ruins through taxation and death duties.
James Lees Milne had the job of visiting and assessing the threatened mansions for the National Trust. When the Trust took on a house, it wanted the family to continue to live there.
I have been accused lately of fostering the interests of the landed gentry at the expense of the poor public. Well, of course, that's absolute piffle. We didn't think that at all. But we knew that unless we were nice to the owners, in other words, could give them some assurance that they could go on living in the houses or part of the houses, we wouldn't get them at all.
James Lees Milne kept a diary of his experiences, including a visit by bicycle to Lord and Lady Berwick at Attingham Hall.
I turned smartly left under an imposing archway off the main Wellington Road. But when the great house hove into sight, a moment of apprehension assailed me. Would Lord and Lady Berwick be very formidable? What would they think of an official from London arriving on a two-wheeler? Lord and Lady Berwick were surprisingly unreserved in explaining that in spite of a large estate, the house was a cruel burden to them. But it had to be preserved at all costs, however onerous, and the marvellous contents kept intact. They were very hard up, and the place was in a pretty bad way. They were rather desperate, I think, and the Trust was a help to them.
But the Trust could not help every impoverished aristocrat who turned to them. The Earl of Stradbroke failed to persuade them to help him with Henham Hall in Suffolk. The Trust could only take on properties which came with a substantial endowment and were of real architectural importance.
Very often I would go, sometimes a long journey to Northumberland or outer part of the country, furthest parts, and even have to stay a night or two to discuss the future of this house. And I might see going up the drive that it clearly wasn't a very important house. So I had to pretend. And I never would say to them, I'm afraid this house is no good. I never did that, even if they asked me. Tuesday, 9th of July, 1946. Reached Wolseley Hall at 3. This place, the property of Sir Edric Wolseley, has belonged to his family since the Conquest. House has a very fine Charles II staircase, but is much altered since first erected. In all other respects, the house is a poor specimen. Grounds and park likewise indifferent. Whole place disintegrating.
Sir Edric's grandson, Sir Charles Wolseley, now walks his dog where Wolseley Hall once stood.
The National Trust weren't in the least interested. James Lees Milne came and looked at it and met my grandparents, and it's mentioned in one of his diaries. A rather amusing view he took of my grandparents.
They, poor things, rather eccentric. We preferred him. Michael was much shocked by the unmade beds and the fuzzy, unbrushed Catholic hair of our hostess.
Anyway, the National Trust wouldn't touch it with a barge pole, with or without an endowment, and quite rightly. It needed £1 million even to slightly restore it, which I didn't have. I still had to pay the estate duty on my grandfather's death. And it was a case of demolishing it. This picture, of course, is one of the last ones of the hall taken, and this shows the demolition in progress, because there was very little option.
Between 1945 and 1955, over 400 stately homes were demolished. At one point, they were coming down at the rate of one every 5 days.